we will continue our chapter respiration, and now we will study about respiration in humans in detail. The process of respiration can be broadly divided into two steps. First is breathing, second is cellular respiration. Breathing is simple a physical activity when we inhale the oxygen-rich air and exhale the carbon dioxide-rich air. While cellular respiration is the actual biochemical process which takes place at the cellular level. Now, for breathing, we need to study about the respiratory tract. The respiratory tract is the passage through which the air enters and reaches the respiratory surface for exchange of gases, and the air is also exhaled out through the same passage. The parts of respiratory tract are: first, the nasal cavity. The air enters from the nostril and reaches the nasal cavity. The nasal cavity has hair which actually filters the dust from the air. It also secretes mucus, which kills the microbes and also traps the dust particles present in the air. So the dust-free air then enters our respiratory tract. Then comes the larynx, which is the voice box. As air moves through the larynx, we are able to produce sound, we are able to speak. So this larynx is known as the voice box. Then there's a windpipe. This windpipe is known as the trachea. Okay, the trachea is collapsible pipe, so it is supported by the C-shaped cartilaginous ring, so that it doesn't collapse, so that it is supported by these rings, the tough rings. Now, the trachea is then branches out into two main branches known as bronchi. The left bronchi enters the left lung, the right bronchi enters the right lung. There are two lungs, they are muscular organs which rest on the muscle called diaphragm. This is the diaphragm on which the lungs rest. Now, after the bronchi enters the lung, it further divides into smaller branches. These branches are known as bronchioles. At the end of the bronchiole, there are air spaces which are called alveoli. There are numerous alveoli which provide large surface area for exchange of gases. I have drawn only few. There are about 3 million alveoli in each of the lung. So the respiratory tract is from the nostrils to the nasal cavity, pharynx, larynx, the trachea, then to bronchi, further branches bronchioles, and finally it reaches the alveoli where actual exchange of gases with blood takes place. Now, let's understand how blood exchange of gases takes place in alveoli. Alveoli are the air sacs. They provide large surface area for exchange of gases. The alveoli have very thin wall through which exchange of gases can easily take place. These alveoli are richly supplied with blood vessels. The pulmonary artery which comes to the lungs has high concentration of carbon dioxide and very low concentration of oxygen, because it collects the deoxygenated blood from the whole body, from all the cells, and bring this deoxygenated blood to the lungs. Now, as the blood travels in these capillaries, what happens? In alveoli, the carbon dioxide concentration is very less, while the oxygen concentration is high. So, oxygen moves from high concentration to low concentration. Movement of oxygen is in this direction, from alveolar air to the blood. While on the other hand, the carbon dioxide concentration is less in the alveolar air but high in deoxygenated blood. So, carbon dioxide travels in this direction, from blood to alveoli. So, in this, what is happening? Oxygen is moving into the blood while carbon dioxide is moving out of the blood vessels. So, this deoxygenated blood becomes oxygenated as it leaves the lungs. So, actual exchange of gases takes place in alveoli, which provide large surface area for exchange of gases. So, three properties of alveoli are: they have large surface area, they are very thin walled for easy exchange of gases, thirdly, they are richly supplied with blood vessels for exchange of gases. Now, what happens after this oxygen enters the blood? It has to be transported to all the body cells, to all body parts for oxidation of food, to release energy. So, once this oxygen enters the blood, we have in our blood there is a pigment, red color pigment called hemoglobin present in the RBCs or the red blood corpuscles. This hemoglobin has affinity for oxygen. The hemoglobin combines with oxygen to form a complex known as oxyhemoglobin. This oxyhemoglobin travels and is transported from the blood to each cell, and oxygen is supplied to the cells. We need a mineral called iron to make this hemoglobin. So if you take the diet which is not rich in iron, so if you are deficient in iron, what will happen? The level of hemoglobin will go down. Your skin will become pale because it is a red colored pigment. So you will always feel lethargic, fatigue or weak. Why? Because this hemoglobin is important in transporting oxygen to the cells. If hemoglobin is less, what will happen? Oxygen will not reach the cells. Oxidation of food will not occur and energy will not be released. That is why you'll always feel lack of energy, lethargic and fatigue. So it's important to eat an iron-rich diet. Now, once the exchange of gases takes place, it is transported to all the cells, and then what happens? This oxygen is utilized in oxidation of glucose to release the energy. Before we move into the types of respiration, let's understand the mechanism of breathing. There are two steps involved in breathing. One is inhalation and second is exhalation. That is taking in air and taking out the air. During inhalation, what happens? The rib cage present around the lungs, they move upward and outward. These ribs, they move upward and outward. While the diaphragm muscle on which the lungs rest, they contract and move downward, become straightened. So by this activity, what happens? The thoracic cavity enlarges. There is a low pressure in the lungs. As the lungs expand, there is a low pressure area here. So what will happen? Air will easily move inward from high pressure to low pressure. So as the rib cage moves upward and outward, diaphragm contracts and moves downward, the whole thoracic cavity enlarges, there is empty space in the lungs, so air will move inward during inhalation as we breathe in. Now, the opposite happens in exhalation. The rib cage will move downward and inward. The diaphragm will relax and become dome shaped. This will contract the thoracic muscles, the lungs will contract and the air will be expelled out because of this activity. So you can see the difference. During inhalation, rib cage moves upward and outward. In exhalation, rib cage moves downward and inward. During inhalation, the diaphragm contracts and becomes straight. In this case, diaphragm relaxes and becomes dome shaped. The thoracic cavity enlarges, the thoracic cavity becomes smaller. Air moves inside the lungs, air is expelled out of the lungs. This is the physical mechanism of breathing, inhalation and exhalation. And after inhalation, what happens? We have studied in detail, the exchange of gases takes place. So the inhaled air contains more of oxygen and less of carbon dioxide, while the opposite, in exhaled air, oxygen concentration is less while carbon dioxide concentration is high. Now, after transportation, when each cell has a rich supply of oxygen, what happens? Let's study about the types of respiration. So basically, we can divide the respiration into two types, aerobic and anaerobic. Aerobic, as the name suggests, it occurs in the presence of oxygen. So the process of respiration which occurs in the presence of oxygen is known as aerobic respiration. The glucose is completely broken down into carbon dioxide, water, and a lot of energy is released. Each molecule of glucose releases 38 molecules of ATP, which we just studied in the last section. Another type is anaerobic respiration. that is in the absence of oxygen. Some unicellular organisms like yeast and some bacteria, they are capable of doing respiration even in the absence of oxygen. Such a type of respiration is known as anaerobic respiration. There is partial breakdown of glucose into alcohol, carbon dioxide, and just 2 molecules of ATP are released from each molecule of glucose. So if you can compare, there is partial breakdown of glucose in anaerobic, but complete breakdown in case of aerobic. Large amount of energy is released in aerobic, very less amount of energy is released in anaerobic. This type of respiration occurs in all multicellular complex organisms like humans. Anaerobic occurs only in yeast and some bacteria. Now, this process of breakdown of glucose into alcohol, organic acids and other materials by microorganisms, this process is known as fermentation. This fermentation process has commercial use like in brewing industries. This is used to produce alcohol in wine, beer, etc. It is also used in bakery because since carbon dioxide is produced, so it makes the bread fluffy, more spongy, more soft. So there are commercial uses of yeast due to its anaerobic properties. Yet, there is another type of anaerobic respiration which occurs in human muscle cells. Now, if you are doing some very heavy exercise, for example, if an athlete is running for a very long time or doing some weight exercises, what will happen? The muscle will need a lot of energy, right? But there won't be rich supply of oxygen. That rate, the demand, supply and demand won't match. In such cases, what happens? The muscles break down the glucose into lactic acid. In the case of lack of oxygen or there is insufficient supply of oxygen, what happens? Glucose is broken down into lactic acid. There is a complete breakdown. So this lactic acid accumulates in the body, in the muscles, and it may lead to muscle cramps. So you must have noticed the athletes after running or after heavy exercise, they feel the muscle cramps. It is because of accumulation of lactic acid. So they breathe heavily or they do massage of that muscle to increase the supply of oxygen to relieve the muscle cramps. So we can just revise. Aerobic respiration is in the presence of oxygen in all the cells of humans. Anaerobic respiration in the absence of oxygen. Sometimes anaerobic respiration in human muscle cells in which lactic acid is produced. So that's all for our life process, that is respiration. Students, the next topic is respiration. Question number 1. What are the various ways in which glucose gets oxidized? So I'll tell you the 3 ways in which glucose gets oxidized. Glucose is a 6-carbon molecule. First of all, it gets broken down into pyruvate, which is a 3-carbon molecule. Now, there are 3 ways in which this pyruvate gets oxidized or broken down. First is in the presence of oxygen. That is, if an organism is undergoing aerobic respiration, like humans, there is a presence of oxygen, then what happens? This pyruvate is completely broken down into carbon dioxide, water, and a lot of energy is released during this process. So there is a complete breakdown. From 6 carbon compound chain, it is broken down into a molecule with 3 carbon. Then it is further broken down into molecules containing 1 carbon only. So there is a complete breakdown of glucose molecules with release of energy. This happens only in aerobic respiration when there is presence of enough oxygen. Now, second case is if there is lack of oxygen. What will happen? Especially it happens in our muscle cells of human. If there is lack of oxygen but the person is doing some vigorous exercise, what will happen? This pyruvate gets broken down into lactic acid, which is a 2-carbon compound plus energy is released. So this happens in human muscle cells, that glucose is broken down into lactic acid which gets accumulated but energy is released. Third case can be, for example, in yeast, there is no oxygen, absence of oxygen. So in yeast, anaerobic respiration takes place when there is no oxygen. They can do respiration, they can break down the glucose into ethanol, which is again a 2-carbon compound. So ethanol plus carbon dioxide plus energy. So these are the 3 various ways in which glucose gets oxidized or broken down to release energy. One is aerobic respiration, anaerobic respiration, and if there is lack of oxygen in human muscle cells. Question number 2. Differentiate between aerobic and anaerobic respiration. So first difference is aerobic respiration takes place in the presence of oxygen, while anaerobic respiration takes place in the absence of oxygen. Second difference is glucose is completely broken down into carbon dioxide, while in anaerobic respiration there is no complete breakdown does not take place. It is broken down into a 2-carbon compound, that is ethanol. Third difference, a lot of energy is released in aerobic respiration. 1 molecule of glucose releases 38 molecules of ATP, which are the energy currency. While in anaerobic respiration, 1 molecule of glucose gives only 2 molecules of ATP. So more energy is released in aerobic while less energy is released in anaerobic respiration. So aerobic respiration takes place in humans and other land animals, while anaerobic respiration takes place in microorganisms like yeast. Next question, how are the lungs or the alveoli, they can ask you question for lungs or the alveoli, designed for exchange of gases? So our windpipe, or which is called the trachea, it breaks down into 2 branches which are called the bronchi, and they enter each lung, left lung and right lung. Now inside the lung they further break down into smaller branches. Now notice a big tree. There is a stem, it divides into 2 branches, then further smaller branches. Similarly, the bronchi also, it divides into very small thin branches which are called bronchioles. At the end of each bronchiole there is an air sac which is called alveoli. It's something like this. At the end there is an air sac called alveoli. Now this alveoli increases the surface area for absorption of oxygen, right? And moreover, it is richly supplied by the blood vessels. There are capillary network of capillaries surrounding the alveoli. So as we breathe in, the air which is rich in oxygen enters the bronchi, then bronchioles, and then reaches the alveoli. This air is rich in oxygen. So this oxygen diffuses into the blood through capillary wall, and whatever blood is coming to the alveoli through pulmonary artery. Pulmonary artery brings the deoxygenated blood back to the lungs. So this blood is rich in carbon dioxide. This carbon dioxide gets diffused back into the alveolar air. So oxygen is absorbed into the blood while carbon dioxide is thrown out of the blood into the alveoli. So the air we breathe in is rich in oxygen, while the air we breathe out is deficient in oxygen but rich in carbon dioxide. So how is the structure of lung designed for exchange of gases? In this you have to explain the structure of alveoli, that they are air sacs, they are very thin walled, and they increase the surface area for absorption of oxygen, and they are richly supplied by the blood vessels for exchange of gases. The next question, what will happen if the person is deficient in hemoglobin? Hemoglobin is a component of blood. It is present in RBCs and it is made from the mineral iron. Now what if the person is deficient in hemoglobin? This condition is called anemia. If a child does not take diet which is rich in iron, it will lead to anemia when hemoglobin content decreases. Now once oxygen enters into the blood, what happens? It makes a complex with the hemoglobin. This is called oxyhemoglobin. And this complex then it is supplied to each and every cell, every tissue, every organ of our body. So actually hemoglobin acts as a carrier which carries the oxygen to different parts of the organ, from the lungs to the other tissues, right. So if the hemoglobin content is low, then oxygen supply to the cell will not be very efficient. The cells of our body or the tissues of our body will not be able to get the enough oxygen. So what will happen, even after small exercise or a little bit of hard work, the person will feel tired, will feel less energetic, lethargic, because of lesser supply of oxygen. As I just told you, oxygen is required for breakdown of glucose to release energy. So if this oxygen is not supplied to the tissue, then energy will not be released and the person will feel tired and lethargic after even small exercise. Next question, describe the process of breathing. Basically, the first step of respiration is breathing, that is inhalation and exhalation. We inhale in the oxygen rich air and exhale out the carbon dioxide rich air, and the exchange happens at the alveolar level. So breathing is only a physical process in which we inhale in air and exhale out. The chemical process is called the cellular respiration. So to describe the process, first you have to divide in two parts, the inhalation and the exhalation. Now during inhalation, the two organs, two parts of the body which play a major role are the diaphragm and the rib cage. So as we breathe in, the rib cage moves upward and outward, which increases the increases the capacity of the lung, it expands them. And the diaphragm, which is a muscle on which the lungs rest, it is curved, so during breathing it just contracts and becomes straightened. So this process increases our thoracic cavity and the air enters inside because there is low pressure inside, so air enters. Once the lungs expand, the air enters inside. Now during exhalation, what happens? The rib cage moves backward and downward, which actually reduces the thoracic cavity and pushes the lungs, and the diaphragm again relaxes and becomes dome shaped. So this reduces the thoracic cavity and air comes out of the lungs. This is exhalation. So in this question you have to describe both the inhalation and the exhalation part and the role played by diaphragm as well as the rib cage.